Special feature for you this evening involving these two gentlemen.
Yeah. I didn't want to risk that chair.
But it's quite, I found it quite unusual, and the MPs were struggling a bit with that, because if someone's campaigning to ban something such as banning nuclear power, or something, then actually you've got to suggest an alternative. So I wonder if you could actually expand a bit on that.
Now, I'm just going to fast forward us to the end, the conclusion that Mr. Avery gave, having bibbled and babbled his way through the interview. And we're going to look at the highlights in a moment, but this was his closing statement.
I mean, it's not my job to get you there. I'm kind of trying to help you along. But that is where you need to get to. So telling me that everything's okay, which isn't quite what you've told me, but telling me that everything's okay here, unless Mark Avery comes up with a better plan, that's not my job.
It's disappointing to think that a director of Wild Justice feels that it's not his job to provide an alternative. After all, if you're going to stop somebody doing something, surely that's because you know better? I think Andrew's already made that point.
A long time ago when I worked for the RSPB, we spent a lot of time, we kind of got out of it eventually, but we spent a lot of time praising grouse moor management as being better than those other two things, wind turbines around. So that has been true, and to the extent that we should give the grouse shooting community any praise at all, we've done that, but moving on, and to the extent that we should give the grouse shooting community any praise at all, we've done that, but moving on, I would say that the future of land that is now managed for driven grouse shooting ought to be carbon storage, providing ecosystem services, so better management to reduce flood risk, improve water quality. And so some of that sounds a bit like rewilding, and there will be people who say, well, the easiest way to get that is just to let everything find its own level. Moving on, that would be one way of doing it, and I think that would be quite a good way to do it, particularly in our national parks. Because if we're not going to rewild, if we are going to rewild anywhere in the uplands, surely national parks would be quite a good place to start. So I think there is a different future, which is an ecological future for current driven grouse moors, and I think public ought to pay for those things. Like, I think public ought to pay for those things. The future of the management of driven grouse moors look as though they want to stay rooted in the 19th century, let alone the 20th, and certainly not the 21st. So I think there's a better future which will serve you well and serve society much better.
But then we have to deal with the reality. So we've got both observational data and also studies. So we know what happens in the urban special protection area when the driven grouse shooting ceased there. We got the collapse in the ground nested bird populations, when that's well documented. We got the collapse of those same assemblages in southwest Scotland, where driven grouse shooting has ceased and has either been replaced by forestry, agriculture, or effectively abandonment, or you might call it rewilding. And in the shorter term now, even if you go up, I spoke to Simon Lester last week, and he'd been up to Langham Moor, and he was talking about on the ground there now, the Sitka spruce, the seed has wind blown in from the neighbouring forestry blocks and is now establishing itself up in those moors. So how realistic do we think it is? And there are lots of people involved here at the fair actually in that management about actually maintaining the habitat for those species. And if we don't look after those species, then where do we expect those birds to go and now live? Because if we alter those habitats into a different structure and it's more wooded or more shrubby, then we will have, where would they go?
Your argument's kind of based on the premise that everything is fine on driven grouse moors, so it clearly isn't. But and I've been to Langham. Moving on. So the thing is, I don't accept that everything is great on driven grouse moors, and I just don't think that keeping everything as it is remotely feasible. You said, oh, we've got to think about what's practical from where we are. Any of you who think that everything or that much is going to stay the same, you're not right. Things are moving on. You can either sit here digging your heels in, saying we've got it right and everybody else has got it wrong, but the world is moving in a different direction. And I mean, places like the RSPB Reserve at Dovestones in the Peak District, producing loads of waders and loads of birds. It's pretty good, and it's pretty new actually. I was talking to the RSPB's chief exec yesterday, which is almost the first. I hardly speak to Becky, but I was telling her that they've got so many good news stories that they ought to get them out, because I said, I'm going to the game fair tomorrow. I'll probably be told by 20 people that the RSPB don't know how to manage their nature reserves. And of course, the RSPB isn't perfect. In fact, I think it's strikingly that's perfect. Now, I don't work for it, but it's not perfect. But the RSPB has got some phenomenal success stories in land management, and they're kind of hidden. So I think it's time to move on, Andrew. Help all these people move on to get to a position where they're getting paid lots of public money, to protect watersheds, peat, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and there will be more than enough room for some of those species that live on driven grouse.
Some? Well, what about the rest of them? Wild justice? Wild justice? I don't see any wild justice here, do you?
More than enough room for some of those species.
You've also made some other comments, for example, about moorland managers trying to stick in the past. I know that's a useful narrative for you, but it's not really the case. So there are people here at this fair that have been managing moors for about 40 years, and at one time the government was telling them they had to dig ditches and drain it. Now they haven't been told to block them up. People have been told to do things over the years, and it's easy to forget when we look at something in only one period of time or one 18-month period about what moorland managers were being asked to do, over the decades. And we also forget that originally a lot of the water abstraction from the uplands was actually to provide fresh water supplies for our own cities. So the first court cases were actually grouse moor owners trying to stop the metropolitan councils from actually carrying the water off the moors and draining it. The first court cases were actually grouse moor owners trying to stop the metropolitan councils from actually carrying the water off the moors and draining it. So actually, I don't think it's fair to say that actually things are sort of stuck in the past and don't want to change. And actually, there is a lot of change, but people are quite sceptical about it. You were talking about burning, and actually, there is an increasing case, and there's a paper out only last week that said that rotational burning helps reduce wildfire risk by 78%. And the reality is that these wildfires are important, and if you've got an entire generation which has never experienced wildfires, then it falls out of memory, and you assume that it's not really a risk. So for my parents, the reality of dealing with wildfires on the Yorkshire moors was very real. My mother still talks about it, and she's early 80s now, but she talks about actually in the village standing out and watching the wildfires burning out of control at night. She's actually quite frightening as children because they weren't actually clear what was really going to happen next. And you're talking about at that stage obviously the limited inability of firefighting ability, and you're talking about the army turning up with bulldozers and bulldozing the peat down to the bedrock in order to be able to create the fire breaks to try and get them out. So it's easy to forget, and we see in North America about the risk of fire, so it's easy to sort of trivialise this and look at it, and actually it is quite clear from DEFRA that they are concerned, and it is in there about burning, about this risk of the wildfire. So I go back to my original question about where can we go where we actually see, if you like, the perfect land management which you're advocating, which would replace driven grouse shooting, and what it actually contributes at the moment, both in terms of the ecological side of things, the economic side, and the social element.
Well, you accuse me of living in the past, but almost all of what you've said is relating to the past. I was talking about the future. So I think there is an opportunity for us to work closer together, but not if the current model of driven grouse shooting is the one that we're all being asked to adopt, because that is based on widespread illegal persecution of birds of prey, massive burning, and a whole load of other things that aren't what the future of the uplands should look like. And we could go. I mean, I'm quite happy to talk about this for the rest of the time, but maybe we ought to move on to something else.
But I'm particularly interested, I think the audience are interested about what is the alternative. Because we need to be clear about what land use is going to provide that employment, the social cohesion, and the ecological uplift that is currently enjoyed. This is a man-made landscape.
I will recap my answer earlier. The land use that will provide that is some walked up grouse shooting, less money, but lower costs, lower rewards, but payment from the public purse, for delivering ecosystem services, for protecting peatlands and for the quality of the water that comes off those lands. That is, and I think quite a lot of people are looking at that, but you cannot deliver that as well as burning these places so often, and you're just not going to get away with doing it in a system that needs widespread persecution of birds of prey to deliver profitable grouse numbers. So move on, chum.
There is an opportunity if we can get the bird of prey numbers up. Actually, it is a really interesting model. The driven grouse model is an interesting model, and we know that the walked up shooting doesn't provide the economic income and the drivers. We see that quite extensively in Scotland in terms of being able to pay for the level of management that's there. And I appreciate and I welcome your comment about, well, the government should pay people to be able to look after that land. But the government only ever has so much money. Eventually it goes, and Ian writes in his book here about the uplift in those bird assemblages. He talks about it's largely, he doesn't say solely, but largely the difference is about the predator control which is implemented by those gamekeepers. And we know that from the work at Langham. So it is I would suggest it's a much more nuanced way forward. And I often, and when I've heard you speak, and I have to be honest, Mark, I sometimes question whether you really want driven grouse shooting to be banned. I'm not sure that you do.
Oh, so sweet of you. I'm quite. Right, let me go back.
But you really want driven grouse shooting to be banned. I'm not sure that you do.
Oh, so sweet of you. I'm quite. Right, let me go back.
But from a conservation perspective, this is a real issue. So if we go back to the Berwyn Special Protection Area, which is one of the few areas where we do have the data. So from it being managed largely for driven grouse shooting, and then actually that ending. And we do see the collapse, and so collapse numbers. So within the special protection area, lapwing went extinct, golden plover went down by 90%, the black grouse by about 89%, ring ouzels went down by 80%, and funnily enough, hen harrier numbers went down by 49%.
It's funny, isn't it, that there is no conservation organisation, apart from yours, GW with a C and then a T, that is arguing for the current situation to remain. Nobody else is saying it was so great when we had driven grouse shooting everywhere that we need to keep it going. Nobody's saying that. You're talking to yourselves.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm nearly out of time, so that's quite enough from me, and it's quite enough from him. Share this video. If you've got it in you to spread this message, then you could be in with a chance to win a very old bottle of champagne, which I've been holding on to for years. For the 100th person to share this, you will be more than welcome to that bottle of champagne. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you next Tuesday. Goodbye.